25th December 2003. Christmas Day in Cotonou, Benin. The air was warm, calm, and carried a gentle breeze from the Gulf of Guinea. Inside the small terminal at Cajaun Airport, the atmosphere felt ordinary, families balancing heavy bags, airport agents flipping through paperwork, and ground staff preparing one of the few international departures scheduled that day. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. On the ramp outside stood a worn Boeing 727, painted in fading blue and white colors of Union des Transports Africains, better known as UTA. The paint barely hid markings from its former operators. The aircraft had arrived earlier from Conakry, Guinea, and was being prepared for its next leg, a flight to Beirut with a refueling stop planned in Libya. For this airline, it was a routine route, serving West African travelers heading to the Middle East, many of them migrants returning home for the holidays. Passengers boarded carrying more than luggage. Some had traveled long distances by road from neighboring countries like Nigeria and Burkina Faso, bringing with them nearly everything they owned. Few had choices when it came to airlines, and fewer still questioned the condition of the aircraft waiting for them. The Boeing 727 itself was over 25 years old, built in the United States and once flown by a major American carrier. Now, near the end of its life, it had been kept flying with second-hand parts and minimal oversight. But in regions where air travel options were scarce, still flying was often considered good enough. As boarding continued and baggage was loaded, nothing appeared unusual. To those watching from the tarmac, this looked like just another departure. Yet, as with many aviation disasters, the real story did not begin that afternoon. It had been forming quietly for years, through ignored rules, missing oversight, and decisions driven by cost instead of safety. And within the next hour, all of those hidden problems would collide. The flight crew arrived at the aircraft shortly after 1 p.m., walking across the hot concrete under the West African sun. There was no jet bridge, no cooling air unit, just a tired Boeing 727 heating up rapidly. The operation around the aircraft was disorganized, with ground staff, passengers, and baggage all moving at once. The captain was a Libyan national with more than 11,000 flight hours, most of them on the Boeing 727. He had flown the aircraft type for years and was deeply familiar with it. The flight engineer had even more experience, logging over 14,000 hours on the same model. The first officer was also believed to be Libyan, but little was known about his background, not because he lacked experience, but because the airline kept no proper personal records at all. Along with the pilots, 4 cabin crew members, 2 mechanics, and a local intermediary boarded the aircraft. This same group flew nearly every UTA flight together. There were no contracts, no defined duty limits, and no guaranteed rest periods. Everyone was paid in cash. UTA operated on improvisation rather than structure. The airline itself was controlled by a single family, with no real corporate framework. There was no safety department, no formal management system, and no oversight culture. Even more concerning, the airline's owner was seated in the cockpit jump seat for this very flight, a detail that would later matter. Although UTA claimed to be registered in Guinea, this was largely symbolic. Guinea lacked the resources to properly regulate an airline, inspect aircraft, or audit records. As a result, UTA operated in a regulatory grey zone, with virtually no external supervision. The aircraft's history was just as troubling. After being retired by previous owners, The Boeing 727 had been stored in the desert before UTA returned it to service. Authorities in Lebanon had once grounded the aircraft over safety concerns. Only minimal repairs were made before it was sent back into operation, and no reliable maintenance records existed to prove what had actually been fixed. This was not just an aging aircraft. It was an aircraft flying without a past anyone could truly verify. Investigators later discovered that UTA kept almost no technical documentation for the aircraft. There were no verified maintenance logs, no engine hour tracking, and no overhaul records. Even the engines themselves raised suspicion. Serial numbers appeared to have been altered, hiding their true time in service. In aviation, this kind of uncertainty is extremely dangerous. The airline claimed that a third-party company had completed a feasibility study for the routes it operated. Such a study should have covered passenger demand, fuel planning, crew duty limits, and aircraft performance. However, investigators were never able to find a single page of this study. Like many other aspects of UTA's operation, it likely existed only in name. In reality, UTA functioned less like an airline and more like a financial shell. It had no real headquarters, no dispatch center, and no proper training system. Its chief pilot, who also acted as the head of quality assurance, was not even certified to fly the Boeing 727. The airline had no official maintenance manuals, no approved minimum equipment list, and no proper dispatch records. When authorities examined UTA's paperwork, they found operating manuals copied from other airlines, referencing aircraft types and destinations UTA had never operated. One investigator described the documents as rushed, poorly assembled, and written only to appear compliant on paper. The only truly organized section of UTA's manuals was a generic statement declaring that safety is everyone's responsibility. In practice, safety belonged to no one. The aircraft leasing arrangement was equally opaque. The Boeing 727 passed through multiple shell companies, making it nearly impossible to identify who was actually responsible for its condition. Following this trail eventually led investigators to individuals already known for operating questionable airlines in regions with weak oversight. This pattern was familiar: old aircraft, unclear ownership, minimal regulation, and paperwork designed to confuse rather than inform. It was an operation built to avoid accountability, and if something went wrong, there would be no one left to hold responsible. And on this Christmas afternoon, that system was about to be tested in the worst possible way. By early afternoon, the aircraft was filling rapidly. The flight was completely sold out, carrying families, workers, and children heading to Lebanon for the holidays. Many passengers were part of the Lebanese diaspora, returning home after years spent working across West Africa. Others were traveling onward after long journeys by road, carrying gifts, personal belongings, and in some cases, their entire lives. The boarding process quickly descended into chaos. Seat numbers were not properly assigned, and some boarding passes carried no passenger names at all. Investigators later learned that tickets had been resold inside the terminal by people who had no intention of flying themselves. Demand for this route was high, and some treated tickets like merchandise. As a result, passengers and baggage were loaded without any real control. There was no accurate passenger count, no proper baggage weighing, and no concern for weight distribution. Children were seated on laps, and some passengers may not have had seats at all. Under normal operations, A load sheet would be completed before departure, documenting passenger numbers, baggage weight, fuel, and aircraft balance. For this flight, no such document could be found. Not just for this flight, but for any UTA flight. Later, investigators recovered stray pages from the cockpit and old load sheets belonging to a completely different airline. None of them matched each other. Each listed a different basic operating weight for the aircraft, and some even referenced a different version of the Boeing 727. The aircraft officially had 140 passenger seats, plus additional jump seats for crew and staff. Every available space was filled. Estimates suggest the number of people on board may have exceeded the aircraft's certified capacity. Without accurate records, investigators could never confirm the exact number of passengers. Some would later vanish from official lists entirely, their names lost because they were never properly recorded in the first place. What was certain, however, was that the aircraft was now dangerously heavy and badly balanced, and the crew had almost no reliable information to work with. About 30 minutes before departure, the cockpit voice recorder began capturing a tense discussion. The first officer noticed something immediately wrong. The paperwork provided to the crew listed only passenger numbers, no total weight, no baggage figures, and no balance data. He voiced his concern clearly. Passengers were boarding with extremely heavy luggage, far more than the paperwork suggested. He warned that without accurate weights, the crew had no way to know whether the aircraft could safely take off. The captain attempted to reassure him, stating they had a passenger manifest. But the first officer pushed back. He pointed out that many passengers were carrying oversized bags and that the aircraft might struggle to leave the ground. His words were chilling. If the aircraft managed to take off, it would be a miracle, otherwise it could end in the sea. At this point, the airline's director, seated in the cockpit jump seat, intervened. He insisted the weight information was correct and attempted to downplay the issue. When challenged, he shifted responsibility, promising that complaints would be addressed after arrival in Birat. The first officer proposed a compromise. If passengers could not be removed, at least the baggage should stay behind. That suggestion was never acted upon. The conversation revealed something deeply troubling. The pilots understood the risk, especially the uncertainty surrounding weight and balance. But they were operating without proper authority, manuals, or institutional support. Saying no in this environment was not simple. Eventually, under pressure and lacking alternatives, the crew prepared to depart. The aircraft was likely overweight, but more critically, its balance was unknown. This was no longer just poor planning. It was a gamble, taken because the system around the crew had already failed them. Although the aircraft's weight was a concern, the greater danger lay in how that weight was distributed. To understand why, it's important to look at something called stabilizer trim. This system controls the angle of the horizontal stabilizer on the tail, which sets the aircraft's natural pitch attitude. For takeoff, trim must be set precisely. If there is too little nose-up trim, the aircraft may struggle to lift its nose from the runway. Too much trim, and it may rotate uncontrollably. The correct setting depends directly on the aircraft's weight and its center of gravity, the point where all weight is balanced. The center of gravity must fall within a safe range along the aircraft's mean aerodynamic chord, or Mach. This position is expressed as a percentage. A forward center of gravity requires more nose-up trim to allow the aircraft to rotate properly. But for this flight, the crew had almost no reliable data. They knew how much fuel was on board and where it was stored. Everything else, passengers, baggage weight, and their placement, was essentially guesswork. The pilots assumed a takeoff weight of around 172,000 pounds and estimated the center of gravity at 19% Mach. Based on that assumption, they set the stabilizer trim to 6.75 units nose up. What they did not know was that nearly all the baggage had been loaded into the forward cargo hold. This shifted the center of gravity much farther forward than expected, closer to 14% Mach. With the center of gravity that far forward, the aircraft should have been set to approximately 7.75 units of nose-up trim. That missing single unit may sound minor, but in aviation, it can be the difference between a safe takeoff and disaster. The aircraft was now heavy, unbalanced, and mistrimmed, facing a hot, humid afternoon with almost no wind. And the crew had no way of knowing just how bad the situation truly was. Before taxi, another problem emerged. Passengers were still standing in the aisles, some arguing over seats that did not exist. The cabin crew struggled to force order before the aircraft could even begin moving. Eventually, the doors were closed and the engines were started. Knowing the aircraft was heavy, the crew took extra precautions. They selected a higher than normal rotation speed, 137 knots, corresponding to a weight significantly above their estimated takeoff mass. This decision was meant to provide an additional safety margin. They also switched off the air conditioning system to extract maximum thrust from the engines. In terms of raw power, the aircraft had enough. Thrust was not the limiting factor. At 13:58 local time, the Boeing 727 lined up on runway 24 and began its takeoff roll. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. The aircraft accelerated far more slowly than expected. Even the air traffic controller noticed how long it was taking to gather speed. Despite all three engines producing full thrust, the runway disappeared rapidly beneath the wheels. When the rotation speed was finally reached, the captain called for rotation. The first officer pulled back on the control column. Nothing happened. The nose lifted only slightly, far less than expected. The aircraft continued racing toward the end of the runway. The captain's voice rose in panic, urging the first officer to pull harder. There were no alarms. No mechanical failures. No warning systems. The aircraft was doing exactly what physics dictated, and that made the situation even more confusing for the crew. The mis-set stabilizer trim was preventing the elevators from generating enough force to lift the nose. Takeoff was still possible, but only with an extreme control input. That input did not come immediately. And with every passing second, the remaining runway disappeared. Faced with a sluggish response, the first officer hesitated. In normal operations, takeoff rotation requires a smooth, controlled pull, not a violent, full-force input. Pulling too aggressively risks a tail strike or aerodynamic stall. Nothing in the first officer's training suggested that extreme force should be necessary. But this was not a normal aircraft. Investigators later calculated that nearly 100 pounds of force on the control column may have been required to raise the nose in time. That level of input would have felt abnormal to any pilot and may have suggested a flight control malfunction rather than a trim issue. By the time the first officer pulled harder, the aircraft had nearly exhausted the runway. Roughly 300 meters from the end, the nose finally began to lift. The Boeing 727 left the ground, but only barely. Now airborne, the aircraft floated just a meter or two above the surface, trapped in ground effect and unable to climb. Airspeed was still low, and the pitch angle insufficient. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold with only about 1.2 meters of altitude. Ahead stood a concrete structure supporting the localizer antenna. Built decades earlier, it did not meet modern clearance standards. It was only 2.4 meters tall, but that was enough. 70 seconds after the takeoff roll began, the landing gear struck the structure. The impact ripped off its roof, injured a worker inside, and tore the landing gear from the aircraft. The right wing flaps were damaged, robbing the aircraft of precious lift. From that moment on, the outcome was unavoidable. With reduced lift, low speed, and damage sustained, the aircraft could not climb. Still moving forward, still descending, the Boeing 727 passed beyond the airport boundary heading toward the beach. After striking the concrete structure, the aircraft remained briefly airborne but continued losing altitude. It clipped a perimeter wall with its tail before slamming into the shallow water just beyond the airport boundary. The impact tore the fuselage apart. The cockpit section separated, the tail broke away, and the main cabin flipped upside down as it slid into the surf. Inside, chaos erupted instantly. Passengers were thrown violently in all directions. Some were not wearing seat belts at all. The water was shallow, but because the aircraft came to rest inverted, it was deep enough to become deadly. Disoriented passengers struggled to understand which way was up. Some managed to escape through torn openings in the fuselage. Others became trapped and drowned. The first officer, who had earlier warned about the risks, was critically injured in the crash and later died in hospital. The captain and flight engineer survived, escaping through damage near the front of the aircraft. The airline's director also survived. Emergency response was slow. The airport lacked a properly equipped rescue unit for a disaster of this scale. Local fishermen, civilians, and airport workers were among the first to reach the wreckage, wading into the water to pull survivors free. In total, at least 141 people lost their lives. 22 survivors were rescued, all injured. The true number of passengers will never be known. Many had boarded without proper records, and some bodies could not be identified. Official counts never matched seat numbers, manifests, or recovered victims. Several people listed as missing were never found at all, suggesting they were swept out to sea. What was left behind was confusion, grief, and a system that had failed everyone on board. In the days that followed, the fragile structure behind UTA collapsed completely. With no proper passenger lists, no maintenance records, and no capable local investigation authority, the government of Benin requested international assistance. France's Aviation Accident Investigation Agency, the BA, took over the inquiry. Their findings were devastating. The final report repeatedly used the word apparently, not because investigators were unsure, but because so little verifiable evidence existed. UTA was exposed as an airline that barely functioned as one. It operated without oversight, accountability, or safety culture. The report detailed failures at every level: regulatory, operational, and ethical. It highlighted how weak international oversight allowed such an operation to exist at all. Yet, despite the scale of the disaster, no criminal convictions followed. Ownership structures were too opaque. Responsibility dissolved into shell companies and paper trails that led nowhere. The BA issued strong recommendations to international aviation authorities, warning that if states failed to properly regulate airlines under their jurisdiction, the entire global aviation system would be undermined. International air travel depends on trust, and in this case, that trust had been badly abused. Today, the wreckage of the Boeing 727 is gone. But its story remains a powerful warning. When rules are ignored, when safety becomes a slogan instead of a system, and when no one is watching, the consequences can be catastrophic. This accident was not caused by a single mistake. It was the result of countless small failures, stacked together until there was no margin left. Remembering this tragedy is not about assigning blame, it is about ensuring that such a breakdown never happens again.